Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be jumping back into our ongoing series about Spawn with Spawn number 22. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in June of 1994, we can see here that this cover is a little bit strange. For one, the Spawn logo itself is actually very small by comparison to most of the books. Usually it's across the entire top of the page, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, this cover kind of reeks of Todd being out of time or needing to rush. For one, the cover has nothing to do with the interior of the book, which that happens, I understand. Issue 21's cover really had nothing to do with the interior of that book. Also, though, it's just, there's not a whole lot going on. First of all, you have the black border that's going around the edges. That's taking up a lot of real estate with, literally nothing. And then the background of this book, or of this cover, is not really anything to get excited about. It's just Spawn standing on a plane, it's just a plane with what I can assume is maybe supposed to be a sky of some sorts, but it's all one color. You have a floating skull because you do, and then weird little sparklies. I mean, you have this great image of Spawn front and center, but the background is kind of lackluster in a lot of ways and not really all that sensical in others. I don't know. It really does feel like Todd was like, all right, here's a cool picture of Spawn and a skull that I drew and not a whole lot else. Story and art, Todd McFarlane. Copy editor and letters, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Steve Oliff and Ollie Optics. The story begins in one of the offices owned by one Tony Twist, the leader of the New York Mafia, and we are now introduced to a character by the name of Joe Sakic, I believe is how you say it. There's no pronunciation key. He is basically the head of all of Tony's accounting, and it is his job to make sure that all of the numbers add up so that if they are ever audited by the IRS and the feds get involved, everything that they're doing money-wise looks legit, despite the fact that none of it is legit. But he's essentially the guy who is in charge of all of Tony's money laundering, and as a result of that, has access to most of Tony's, personal information and financial dealings and, just tons of info that almost nobody else knows, which makes him a prime target if you want to find out about things that Tony's doing behind the scenes. And since Spawn very much wants to know what Tony is up to behind the scenes, he decides to pay Joe a visit in what is actually a really cool full-page splash image here. The idea of Spawn just appearing behind Joe and scaring him. You can see the look of terror in his face, dropping the pen. This is one of those, classic McFarlane images where, the image itself really doesn't have a whole lot going on. It's literally Spawn standing in a dark room behind a guy who's sitting at a desk, but he makes it really dynamic in the way that he drew it, capturing, the surprise and fear on Joe's face as he's trying to get away, startled by this, huge demonic guy wearing a cape. This is a really cool image. I appreciate this a lot. Now, Spawn gets right in Joe's face and tells him that he wants to know exactly what Tony is up to and is not going to leave until Joe gives him the files that he needs, or he's going to kill him. Joe, of course, is quite terrified about all of this and still just as terrified of betraying Tony Twist, which he should be. So he decides to instead try to cover for Mr. Twist, telling him that he's away on business. Spawn doesn't buy it. And Spawn tells him that he's not going to play games with him as he puts his fist right up to Joe's face and states that if he doesn't give him the information he wants, that things are going to get real ugly for Joe real quick when the two of them are suddenly interrupted by some other employees of one Tony Twist. We see then that two of Tony's mafia goons have broken into the office as they heard the commotion and yell at Spawn to freeze or they're going to open fire. Spawn turns to them and before even actually consciously thinking about it, his costume on its own springs into action as its chains lunge forward. However, we see the goons open fire, and suddenly the costume uses the chains to start deflecting all of the bullets being shot at Spawn. And this is actually a really cool moment because this is sort of illustrating that the level of synergy that Spawn has with his costume is growing at this point. And up until now, we've always just seen Spawn tanking bullet fire and getting shot, and his body will heal from essentially any wound, but that does potentially use up some of his power, especially if the wound is really bad. That's why his face is sewn shut. Spawn could have actually just healed that gunshot wound to his forehead immediately. However, it drains far less of his power to let his body heal it on its own. So we now see that as a result of him starting to realize that he needs to conserve his energy and the costume reacting to that it's actively trying to prevent him from taking damage altogether. And I thought this was a really cool way to illustrate that. As the goons continue their hail of bullets, they quickly exhaust their magazines and then look at each other in disbelief and shock as they realize that they're out of rounds and the guy that they were just unloading on hasn't taken a single hit. However, before they can reload, a desk is hurled across the side of the room, smashing both of their heads against the wall and then falling on top of them as we see two bloodstains on the wall that is crushed in now, with Spawn's shadow looming above them and the speech bubble of Joe saying, "Oh my God," as he can't believe what he just witnessed. Realizing now that there is literally no one coming to his aid, we see Joe try to run away from Spawn even though there's nowhere to go and hide the files that he was working on, despite the fact that Spawn's literally just on the other side of the room. There's no way he's going to hide these files, but he is doing his best to remain loyal to Tony Twist. Spawn corners him, stating, "Give me the files behind your back." And Joe realizes that, essentially he has no other options at this point as he hands over the files to Spawn. And Spawn is rather surprised to find out that the files Joe was working on were actually about Terry Fitzgerald and not him. And thanks, Joe, for cooperating with him as he leaves with the files. Unfortunately for Joe, the circumstances in which he had to hand over the files don't matter to Tony Twist. And Tony decides that since he's now been betrayed by Joe, Joe is more of a liability and decides to dispose of his body with the hands, feet, and head cut off underneath the George Washington Bridge. And when the police find this body, they have no leads to go on and no ways to identify it, and chalk it up to just another random murder and register him as a John Doe. And that's the story of Joe Sakic in the universe of Spawn. We then see a close-up image of the eye of a fly as we overhear a conversation where Twitch is talking to Sam and giving him the rundown on the information that they got from the informant that they basically put a shakedown on in the last issue, and states that he's come through with flying colors and given them the information from the bums around the alleyways as to the very specific area that they can find Spawn lurking about. And, despite all of this rundown that Twitch is giving him, Sam seems to be a lot more preoccupied with trying to eat this donut that has a fly on it than listening to anything Twitch is telling him, as the fly jumps away just in the nick of time to prevent itself from being eaten by Sam. We then get treated to this fantastically drawn image that takes up half the page of Sam biting into and chewing the donut, which again is a great illustration of, Todd taking a very mundane image and making it look super cool. There's nothing special about a guy chewing a donut, but he made it look awesome on this page here. Sam is happy to find out that their efforts have paid off and that the informant has given them useful information, as he and Twitch plan to go into the alleyways tonight to see if they can finally confront Spawn. As they make their way out of the police precinct, they're interrupted by one of their co-workers by the name of Fred, who begins to mock them, calling them Ren and Stimpy, poignant reference in 1994, and also states that, wow, what are you guys doing going out to muscle up a few homeless guys again and chase a ghost? And without even hesitating, Sam spits all of the donut he was chewing into Fred's coffee as he and Twitch make their way out of the precinct, causing Fred to just be really upset and be like, hey man, you ruined my coffee. I thought this was actually a funny little gag for McFarlane to throw in here. And it adds to the personality of Sam being this like really rough around the edges cop. We are then teleported to the office of Jason Wynn as we see him sitting in the dark with his hands folded. He's starting to really worry about the walls closing in on him at this point. He still has no explanation to his superiors about what happened to him when the angels kidnapped him and made him the anti-spawn, and he then suddenly reappeared 2 days later in his office. Obviously, that's not a story he can go to them with, but he doesn't have a cover story that's believable. And right now, he's just got, the few people that he answers to, which are stated in this long bit of text here, to be basically just the president, the vice president, and the joint chiefs of staff, which unfortunately doesn't really mesh with the way that the government and government agencies are portrayed in the Wildstorm universe, which in today's world of 2024, as I'm recording this, doesn't really matter since Wildstorm is no longer part of Image. But at this time, they were still trying to do the Image shared universe. So, Wynn kind of doesn't really make sense when, you start putting him into a world with characters like Craven and Lynch. It was kind of a mess the way that they had those heads of super secret government agencies all portrayed at the early stages of a universe that ultimately didn't work out. So again, it doesn't matter at this point, but at that point, they weren't doing the best job of it. Wynn realizes that he's got to figure out what's going on. He still has no way to explain the files that Spawn took disappearing from the CIA building that they were in. He also has no way of explaining how the weapons that Spawn took were taken and not been accounted for since. And he realizes that these are mistakes that bode very poorly for a man in his position, and that he is in real danger of losing that position and all of the power that comes with it. Also, I do actually really like this page, despite the fact that it's almost entirely just black ink and doesn't have much going on in the way of, highly detailed illustration. I think it really illustrates the mood and demeanor of Jason Wynn as he just sits alone in the dark pondering what his next move is. And this is a really good use of minimalism on Todd's part. A lot of times this is something that I would criticize in other books as just being like a way to save time and not draw a background. But right here, I think it's a perfect encapsulation of the tone of what's going on with this character in particular. We are then teleported to the office of Terry Fitzgerald. Terry working diligently on translating some files from Russian and, being kind of bored with his work. I find it kind of funny at this point that despite the fact that Wynn is pushing the narrative that Terry is a rat in the CIA and that he's, some sort of a double agent or selling secrets to one of the US's enemies, that they're allowing him to just keep going about his business at the job and, haven't put him on administrative leave or anything. He's really just, kind of bored with his work, but also worried about the fact that he's got, so many people who believe that he's an enemy of the US now, and as he's lost in his thought, he gets interrupted by a scream from the outside of his office. As he runs out, he sees his secretary cowering against the wall as she states that, what is this? What happened? And he looks on the desk to see that a gift was delivered to his office with a rat that has a dagger stabbed through its chest and a note that says, "Hey Fitzy, you're a dead rat, you're friends." And he tries to calm her down and states there's no need to call security. He's going to clean it up. But he also realizes that the people who want to take him down are becoming very brazen at this point. And for the first time starts to really worry about the safety of himself and his family as he believes that it's very possible that they're in some real danger at this point. We're then teleported back to the alleyways where we see Spawn sitting on his newly constructed throne that was built by the homeless men living in the alleyways as he continues to pan through the files that he stole from Tony Twist. This is the first time we see the throne depicted in the mainline series. If you've watched my Violator miniseries episodes, you do see it in that, but this is supposed to be happening at roughly that exact same time frame. So, the continuity works out. Spawn is shocked reading through these documents as he realizes that the mobster Tony Twist actually believes that Terry Fitzgerald is Spawn, and that Spawn's actions have put Terry in real danger at this point. As we're teleported to yet another location, we see Tony Twist himself walking alongside a scientist that works for him as they speak about the repairs and upgrades being made to Overt-Kill, who, as we saw, was nearly completely destroyed by Spawn in the fight that the two of them had. The scientist explains to Tony that, he's completely upgraded the way that Overt-Kill's armor systems work, and that the weapons that were used to defeat him prior to now will no longer be effective against him. He also states that there's a few problems with the memory wipe that they tried to do, and he wasn't able to get rid of all of the information that Overt-Kill had in his systems, but Tony says that's not important right now, as he needs Overt-Kill operational tonight in order to take care of Terry Fitzgerald, who once again he believes is Spawn, as the two of them enter another locked room and Tony hits the lights. We then see Tony and the scientist standing in front of Overt-Kill, who is hooked up to all kinds of electrodes and sensors and wires, as they complete the final repairs of making him operational again in hopes to kill Spawn. Tony states that he's then happy to see that this is all going to work out, and he believes that both of his problems are going to be solved by the end of the night. The other problem he's referring to is that of the Violator, who he is having the Admonisher track and kill, hopefully. Of course, this is the storyline that's being addressed in the Violator miniseries. If you'd like to know more about that, check out all of my videos on the Violator miniseries, which are in my Spawn miniseries playlist. Tony smiles to himself as he believes that, everything's going to be A-okay and he can get back to business as usual when he eliminates the Violator and Spawn. Then we are teleported back to the home of Terry Fitzgerald, where we see Terry sitting alone in his living room. He rushed home after having the rat delivered to his office to make sure that his family was safe. Unfortunately, in his panic, he forgot that Wanda and Cyan were actually out today across town visiting Grandma Blake. And he sits at home, not having any way to contact them, really. Keep in mind, early 90s, so it wasn't like every single person had a cell phone in their pocket at this point. As Terry stares at the window and wonders what's going on, he just keeps, praying to himself, please let Wanda and Cyan be okay. He opens up the window to look outside and sees a car with two government agents who have been trailing him the whole way. They're parked in plain view because they know that he's going to see them and they want him to see them. And also, keep in mind at this point, Terry has no idea that Tony Twist believes that he is Spawn and is also looking to kill him. He really just believes that the only danger to him and his family right now is presented by the CIA and other government agencies. However, the CIA men also don't know that Terry is being followed and tracked by Tony Twist, and they are surprised when another car pulls up behind them and two of Tony's goons hop out. The two men inside, Andy and Phil, realize that something is not right here, as they state that, they need to do something about this when they notice the guns the men are carrying. And Phil states that Andy needs to radio it in, but Andy says they don't have time. The two of them jump out of the car and yell at Tony's men to freeze. Tony's men also didn't know that the CIA was trailing Terry Fitzgerald, but they don't ask any questions and instead turn and open fire on the two CIA agents. The agents return fire. Terry at this point, loses it, grabs a rifle from his own home, runs out the front door, and tells them all to get out as we see two mafiosos and two CIA, agents having a gunfight in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. However, upon seeing Terry, they all stop what they're doing, turn, and open fire on Terry. We see Terry jump down, taking cover, being, barely missed by all of the hail of bullets that are being shot in his direction. And then we see him looking out from underneath a bush, understandably terrified as four men are trying to kill him right now. However, the mafiosos decide to not waste the opportunity and instead then turn their guns on the CIA agents and mow them down in a hail of bullets. And this is turning into a real mess of a day for one Terry Fitzgerald. After the gunfire stops, one of the mafia goons yells to Terry, who is still hiding behind the bush, that they do in fact have his wife and daughter, and if he wants to keep them safe and alive, he needs to show up to a very specific alleyway in New York City at midnight, or the worst is going to happen. They then get in their car and speed off as Terry comes out from behind the bush and stands above the bodies of the two CIA agents who have been killed and are lying in pools of blood. He realizes that there's no way he's ever going to be explaining this to anyone who shows up authority-wise, especially when the entirety of the CIA believes that he's a traitor anyway. Unfortunately for Terry, the line about his wife and daughter being kidnapped by the mob is a complete fabrication. Wanda and Cyan are actually safe in a park with Grandma Blake right now, being observed by the mafia, but not actually in their custody. When Terry goes to check Grandma Blake's house, though, he will find that it's empty, and this will only lend credence to their lie. And Terry, you gotta feel terrible for him at this point, man. He's just a guy who was living his life, trying to serve his country, trying to be a good husband and father, and all of this stuff that's happening to him right now is a result of the actions that have been taken by Spawn. And, it's kind of just like a really good way to give Spawn a vulnerability that he would not otherwise have. He himself is, nigh invincible to most of the weaponry or, villains that he's faced up until this point. And so the way to make him vulnerable is to put the people around him that he cares about in danger. And this is what we see Todd doing. And it's a really good, plot device in terms of, just giving Spawn this weakness of trying to protect the people around him and also not being able to control all of the moving pieces that are going on. It's really well written. I like this part of the story. Meanwhile, back in the alleyways, speaking of Spawn, he's still sitting on his throne when one of the homeless men runs up to get his attention and states that there's a black guy in the alleyways who's being followed by a big giant robot guy. Spawn realizes, of course, that this is Terry. He may not necessarily assume that it's Overt-Kill who's following him, but the man does describe that the robot guy following him is the size of a bus and that Terry's in real danger. And Spawn kind of puts two and two together at this point as he walks off to grab the weaponry that he stashed from their previous fight in hopes of using it to defeat him once again. Meanwhile, a few streets away, we see Terry hiding behind a dumpster with his gun drawn, ready to face what he believes will be regular mafia goons. However, he's quite surprised when he hears the large footsteps of one Overt-Kill as he turns around, shocked, when Overt-Kill picks up the dumpster that he was hiding behind and throws it to the side as, he says, "Nice to see you again, hero," as even Overt-Kill believes that Terry is in fact Spawn. Terry, however, is of course not privy to any of that information and really not certain why the mafia wants to kill him or harm his family, but he does believe that his time is up at this point as he falls back with his gun pointed at Overt-Kill. He simply says, "Wanda, Cyan, I love you," which is really kind of touching. I mean, he's, again, he's a guy put in a situation that he doesn't understand because none of the people that are after him because of anything he did. It's all the actions of Al. So there's all this confusion. There's all of this anger, there's all of this fear coursing through his body, and now he believes he's going to die, and he doesn't even know why that's happening. Back in the other alleyways with Spawn, we see Spawn frantically throwing boxes and debris all over the place as he can't remember exactly where he hid the weapons that he used to kill, or I shouldn't say kill, defeat Overt-Kill earlier. And he's really getting upset as he realizes that all of the time he's wasting right now is potentially costing his, former best friend his life. As we see garbage being thrown all over the place, Spawn is completely distracted to the point where he doesn't notice other people coming up behind him, as he is then confronted with a pistol barrel pressed right up against the side of his head and a man saying, "Don't move." We then see that the gun is being wielded by none other than Twitch, as Sam and Twitch have finally tracked down Spawn and plan on confronting and most likely arresting him. Spawn simply states, "Fellas, I don't have time for this right now," as, he's really kind of stuck in his own predicament now, as he needs to get to Terry's side to help him, but he also doesn't want to actually harm Sam and Twitch, as they're actually like good cops, and, they're trying to do the right thing, and, obviously he understands how everything looks. And then the final image of the story, we see a close-up of Overt-Kill as he prepares to deliver the final blow to Terry, and the story is to be continued. We then see image info once again, nothing special. It's the same as it always is, just blurbs about upcoming Image books at the time. We then, of course, get to the spawning grounds. Most of the letters in this month's issue were basically just thanking Todd for the work that he and Frank Miller did with the Spawn Batman crossover and congratulating him and Frank on doing a great job with it. However, one of the letters I really like because he brings up a lot of the questions that I've had in the past. If you've watched multiples of the episodes that I've done on the Spawn issues, he brings up that Spawn's mask kind of disappears and reappears at random, and that also in the issues where the medieval Spawn was the character being portrayed, his sword blade was never drawn the same way twice in any two panels. The same thing with Chapel's knife in the issues where Spawn and Chapel fought each other. And it's just, again, that whole blade is just constantly being drawn in a completely different matter. Both things that I pointed out, along with, Spawn's costume is truly not always exactly the same. Now, in terms of the costume, Todd does explain that. He says, it's a living entity and it's constantly in flux. And then also admits to the fact that a lot of times he just makes mistakes and forgets that, one panel he drew with Spawn having the mask off and then suddenly it's on and then suddenly it's off again. Obviously these are almost always errors that Todd is having, but at the same time, he can play it off in the fact that he is right. Spawn's costume is alive and it can, put up the mask and pull down the mask at will of its own volition, and it doesn't need Spawn to consciously do it. But I do find it amusing that, I'm not the only person who was realizing that there was some illustrative continuity errors going on in these books. And, I'm not the only one who's a stickler for that kind of nitpicky type of stuff. We then get a 2-page ad for the Savage Dragon. This part is just a blurb written by Terry Fitzgerald where he's basically praising Eric Larson for a fantastic comic. I agree with Terry. And then we get a big full-page splash of the dragon himself. If you'd like to know more about the Savage Dragon, please feel free to check out my Savage Dragon playlist. We then see 2 pages of fan art submitted of the Violator. This, of course, is in response to the Violator miniseries. If you would like to know more about the Violator miniseries, as I stated before, you can check it out in my Spawn miniseries playlist. We then see an advertisement for Wildcats issue number 13, and while I have not made it to issue number 13 so far in my series about Wildcats, if you would like to know more about Wildcats, just like the others, feel free to check out my Wildcats playlist. We then see an ad for Shadowhawk, Chapel, Wildcats, 1963, The Others, Supreme, and Spawn. All Image properties at this time. Well, not properties, Image comics at this time. All the properties are owned specifically by their creators. I don't have videos on all of this stuff. Currently, as I'm recording this, I only have videos on Shadowhawk, Wildcats, and Spawn. I'm getting close to being able to try and do some stuff with Supreme. I haven't gotten into Chapel yet. I actually don't have an issue of 1963 or the others, so I'll have to try and hunt those down. But again, if you want to look into more or would like to know more about the books that I named that I do have videos on, feel free to check out those playlists. We then see an ad for Wizard number 36, in which you could enter a contest to win a Mortal Kombat 2 arcade cabinet. I don't know how many of those were given away. My guess would be probably just one, but maybe a couple. I don't know. It depends on how many Midway was willing to give them. But super cool contest to be able to enter back in the day, man. Despite the fact that owning an arcade cabinet is actually kind of a hassle when you consider the fact that you need somewhere to put it and, how many people are going to come over and play it with you. But, if you're the kind of person who was into that, you could have entered to win this contest. And we then get into the big reveal and, kind of little early sneak peek at the Wildcats animated series. We've actually seen this in some of the Wildstorm books as well, but we'll go through it real quickly right here. For those of you who don't know, this series originally aired on Saturday mornings on CBS. Of course, it has all of the same characters from the mainline story, which are all depicted right here. Nothing special about that. We then see a few of these storyboards being depicted, showing how they're doing layouts for the animation. And we get a little blurb here where Jim Lee kind of talks about, how he's proud of his characters, but he also believes that Nelvana, yes, will do a terrific job bringing them to life. Explaining to the fans like, hey, I'm an illustrator, but I'm not an animator. And it would be crazy to think that Jim Lee, even if he was an animator, could completely animate a full 13 episode series of a cartoon by himself. But again, there was a lot of people who probably didn't understand the way that, the animation industry works versus the comic book industry and thought that maybe Jim would be able to draw all this stuff. But again, that's completely unrealistic and crazy to think that that would be the case. We then see some concept art kind of depicting the Demonite hover ship known as the Behemoth and Hellspawn. These are kind of cool, like little production or pre-production things to see. I like when they show off that kind of stuff. And on the final page of the book, we get a rundown of the team who is working on the animated series, along with, Jim Lee. Obviously, he's the guy who created everything. And like I stated, this has been seen in some of my other videos and some other Wildstorm books. And on the reverse inside cover, we get a full page ad for Gen 13 number 0. If you'd like to know more about Gen 13, feel free to check out my Gen 13 playlist. And that was Spawn number 22. Now, remember at the beginning of the video when I said it felt like the cover was a little bit rushed and that Todd was potentially pressed for time and couldn't go full detail on it, and it just seemed like, something he threw together at the last minute? Well, those of you who were paying real close attention may have noticed that he only drew just over half of a comic book for this issue. It literally goes one page past the halfway point of the book, and that's where the story ends. And the whole back half of the book is basically nothing but the letter section and advertisements. This is really the point where Todd is starting to get way behind on production for Spawn in terms of his ability to keep up. Keep in mind, he's also, founding McFarlane Toys at this point and has 1,000,001 things going on between Spawn, McFarlane Toys, the day-to-day runnings of Image Comics. And this is where, he's having to cut some corners and it's becoming obvious. Now, that being said, I will state that the artwork inside of this issue is top-notch. Todd was drawing really detailed stuff throughout most of the pages that he did pencil. And we saw some really cool full-page splashes and, some highly detailed things, very, detailed backgrounds in a lot of the pages. But again, he did that because he didn't draw a full issue of the book. So this is where I think Todd started to realize that he needed to hand off the penciling duties to someone else, which is why in the very near future, we're going to see Greg Capullo take over those penciling duties full time. Now, that being said, I felt like the issue was actually really good. It really did a great job of illustrating, all of the different people who are working against Spawn, but in actuality believe that they're working against Terry. And we also see Spawn realize that, there's been an effect and a cost for all of the action he's been taking, and it's manifesting in a very negative way for the people he really cares about in Terry Fitzgerald, and by association, Wanda and Cyan. And, this is a really important point in the backstory of Spawn, or in the early days of Spawn realizing that, he can't just go out and do whatever he wants. There's real ramifications for the actions that he takes. And when he starts poking the bear, and that bear is big in terms of, Jason Wynn and Tony Twist, then the outcomes can be very dire for people around him. So I really like that story point that Todd's getting across, that, despite Spawn, I should say, being, incredibly powerful, he's got to be really careful about what he does and how he does it. But then again, these are all just my opinions. Your opinions may be completely different. You may not be upset that Todd only drew basically half of an issue of a comic book. And you might think that the story was dumb and didn't have enough action. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everybody's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.